all black everything, all black, you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black, yo.
We were taking well over 100 strokes per night.
Push-ups, liquor, chug until you throw up.
It's peer pressure in its rawest form.
Welcome to Left to Black. My name is Anthony Neal, the host. We are beginning our 13th season of bringing conversations from the Left to Black perspective to the world, and we are honored to be joined today by award-winning filmmaker Byron Hurt. Most folks know him for his groundbreaking films, Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, which I was honored to participate in. There are only certain examples of Blackness that we're going to let flow through this space. And when it comes to hip hop, there's certain conventions in which we want to see. We want to see kind of the hardcore thug.
Good Lord, good meat. Come on, let's eat. Hallelujah.
The award-winning film Food Junkies that features Dick Gregory. What has been a hallmark of Byron Hurt's career has been his ability as a filmmaker to go on a journey and take the audience with us in that case. And that certainly is the case here with his new film, produced with Independent Lens, Hazing. How you doing today, Byron?
I'm doing great, Mark, and congratulations on 13 years. That's quite an accomplishment.
Well, thank you very much. And, you know, I watching this film, man, and I remember when you started this film, and I was not a member of a D9 organization at that time. I am now, and clearly my perspectives have changed a little bit, you know, since that process. But, you know, you had always been open about, you know, the role of Black fraternities in your own career, right? It's something that, you know, that's a part of Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, for instance. Mm-hmm. And, you know, like your earlier films, you really begin this process by questioning your relationship to these organizations, why you wanted to be a part of them. You mentioned that it was the hardest thing you had ever gone through in your life. So talk about your journey, first of all, you know, to your D9 experience, you know, as a member of Omega Sci-Fi, but also what pushed you to do this film?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, just like each one of my films, you know, they're born out of my great love and respect for Black people, Black culture, Black institutions, who we are, you know, just as a people, you know, coming through, you know, the history of white racism, white supremacy in this country, and all that we've had to do to overcome those things and still overcome those things and survive. And, you know, the Divine Nine, Black Greek letter organizations, are a collective group of organizations that were founded, you know, to help us navigate through a system of white supremacy, particularly in the education system, on college campuses. So I have great respect for the Divine Nine in terms of, you know, who we are and what we've done historically to empower Black people, Black students, and the Black community. Really, to be quite honest with you, you know, this film was inspired by, you know, a couple of stories, you know, that we include in the film. You know, one was a story of George Dune, who was a young man who died as a member of a fraternity at Cornell University. He was not pledging the fraternity. He was actually a member who died during a hazing ritual. It was like a turnabout sort of ritual where, you know, the pledgees got to pledge the big brothers, and he was tied, his hands were tied together, his feet were tied together, and he was forced to drink alcohol to the point where, you know, he became over intoxicated, ended up dying. I read that story on an airplane, reading the New York Times. And I'm going to tell you, Mark, I mean, I nearly cried. I mean, you know, I was just so heartbroken by the story, particularly because his mom lost her only child. You know what I mean? And that was just devastating to me. It made me question further some of the rites of passage processes that we go through. And when I say we, I'm not just talking about the Divine Nine now. I'm talking about in general, you know, the rites of passage, you know, processes, which include hazing. And I just wanted to get underneath it, you know. And the second story was Robert Champion. You know, I saw his story on the news, And again, it was that same feeling. And so for me, it wasn't so much that I wanted to question the Divine Nine or my relationship to the Divine Nine. It was really about me wanting to get underneath the culture of hazing in ways that I felt that I was uniquely qualified to do and prepared to do because of my experience as a member of a fraternity who had gone through a very, a very arduous process that included hazing. At that time, we're talking about 1990, different time, different era, different space. But a lot of these rituals do linger and do continue in spaces that include, the Divine Nine.
One of the things that struck me, Byron, when we talk about fraternity hazing, right? And it's very easy for us to think about white males, too much alcohol, all the stuff that have pretty much defined our view of fraternities, going back to films like Animal House in the 1970s.
Yeah.
You obviously take that on, right? The case of Penn State, both the student there at Penn State who was a whistleblower, and then for Penn State to fail to follow up 2 years later, for something else to happen, we understand those tragedies, right? But to put the lens on the D9, right, is to raise other kinds of questions. There are some folks who might say that you're airing dirty laundry. What kind of resistance did you face? One of your brothers in the film who does this kind of work, right, to push back to us to think more broadly. And this is a question that you ask him in the film. What's the resistance factor in terms of trying to talk to folks and explain to them what you're trying to achieve with the film in that regard?
Yeah, I have received pushback. There's no question about that. But I've also received a lot of support. I've been getting a lot of DMs over the last week and a half from fraternity members who support the film. There are many of my fraternity brothers who have seen the film in its entirety, and they realize that this film does not, this is not like a takedown piece, for my organization, Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. That it takes a broader look at the culture of hazing, not just the Divine Nine. So I tend to focus on my fraternity brothers and other members of the Divine Nine who have been really supportive. I just got a DM and a comment from someone from a D9 sorority, who was extremely supportive of the film, and people are talking about the level of courage that it took to take on this issue, especially being a member of the Divine Nine, because we all know this is not something that you really talk about publicly. You don't air D9 laundry, and my intent is to make us better, is to get us to have conversations, to create awareness, to create like culture shift. Not just in practice, but in the mindset of of those of us who continue to hold on to old traditions that we have to let go, that are no longer useful to us. Because at the end of the day, I think what we all want is for our organizations to continue to thrive and survive. And when if one or two hazing cases could devastate many of our organizations, if we were to be sued, so there's just, I think that there are a lot of positives that people can focus on with this film. And that's what I'm doing. I'm focusing on the good that the film can do.
Byron, before folks publicly talked about toxic masculinity, that was the work that you were doing, have been doing for more than 20 years now.
Every single person in this room has some unique gift, has some talent, has a voice, has influence.
Whether it's both in terms of the workshop that you've done with folks like Jackson Katz, on your own, and of course in your films, were you surprised that you would find so much evidence of hazing among sororities, right, as opposed to fraternities, where it almost seems that piece of toxic masculinity is built into the fabric of fraternities, regardless of race, right? But were you surprised to see as much of that occur in the context of sorority life?
No, I wasn't surprised, to be honest with you. I can't say that I was surprised. I think that the kind of hazing that exists in sororities it's just different. It takes on a different sort of a feel than it does in fraternities and even with in sports culture, especially male sports. It's just a different version of what boys. It's really about in groups, you know what I mean? Being super protective and defensive of outsiders, who are seeking entry into their group, right? And trying to make that process as challenging as possible so that people are proving their worth, they're proving their value and their loyalty to that organization. And so, young people devise all sorts of rituals in order to guard, the sanctity of their organization. And, without proper supervision or without, experienced people, who are there to help guide that process, a lot of times it descends into hazing. There was one person, Michelle Gubadia, who is she is like the director of Greek life at UNC Charlotte.
Mm-hmm.
She talked about how, she really sort of tried to put on her sleeve, some of the ways that she saw men hazing pledges, right? Trying to prove that she was just as tough as guys.
Right.
They're different, but the result can be the same in terms of the outcome. And that's causing harm to people who are seeking to join an organization that they think is going to benefit them in some way.
The real stars of the film, I think, Byron, are the parents of the survivors. The part of the film where you're sitting talking to many of them. One of the striking cases, of course, that you mentioned already was Robert Champion. And many of us remember those conversations, right, that came out of FAMU at that time. And, one of the things that came out in the film that was really striking to me, that ritual that they went through with these new bandmates.
Yeah.
And how it was something that the institution had been aware of for decades. How do you look at this film and think about some of the institutional responsibilities and responses, right, to these hazing deaths and the trauma caused about it, right? Because that's the other piece of it, right? We tend to focus only on the deaths, right? But there are these lingering effects to the process, right, that folks live with for a long time, afterwards.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Ricky Jones says something in the film that's very powerful. He says that either these institutions don't want to change hazing culture or don't know how, right? Or don't know how. And I think that that's true. And I think it could be both and, I think that it's a combination of the two things. And, of course, institutions are designed to protect themselves and to, preserve the institution, by all means. And, I think, what I've seen happen in many of the stories that I've researched, and I'm not even talking about, the stories that are in the film, but, there are countless stories where, you see the same sort of institutional responses, that they weren't aware of the situation. They weren't, they basically pass the buck and don't take any accountability or they don't own the issue. And so I think that that's a big part of the problem. And I do see a shift, though. I mean, I do see, organizations and institutions that are, working to end or eradicate hazing culture, or at least shift the culture to the best of their ability. But I think, Mark, to be quite honest with you, I think one big problem, Mark, is that people, the actual people who comprise the organizations, they need permission to speak up against it. They need someone or people around them in their peer culture who are courageous enough to actually stand up against whatever hazing culture exists and to work against it. You know what I mean? So that whole silence piece. The loudest voices are the ones who support what's going on and don't want it to end, right?
Right.
And so I think we have to develop, young people who have the courage, the self-awareness, who are empowered enough to actually stand up and change the culture. And I think that's the direction that we need to go in conjunction with, really strong leadership at the head of these organizations and institutions, who set the culture, who set the tone of the culture from the top down.
What struck me time and time again when you talk to survivors of hazing and you ask them why they stayed in the process.
Yeah.
And to a woman and a man, they all responded because I had a responsibility to the person whose arms I was locked to, right? Mm-hmm. I had a responsibility to the group, the one Kappa brother who was like, if I wasn't there, then the rest of them would have to take up for what was missing in me. Mm-hmm. And talk about that balance between going through a kind of process of trauma, but also trying to build brotherhood and sisterhood in the context of that, when you know that it's something that's wrong and damaging to not only to you, but also potentially to someone, who you've decided to be a brother or sister to.
Well, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of different dynamics at play. You know what I mean? And, I wanted to become an Omega because, in part because my uncle was an Omega, my uncle James Hogan, who recently passed away. He pledged at Morehouse in the 1960s, and he was somebody I looked up to. And, I think looking back, part of me wanted to prove to my uncle that I was strong enough, that I was capable enough, that I was manly enough, that I was good enough to be a member of his organization. And I think that, people have various reasons why they continue to participate in a process that either degrades them, shames them, humiliates them, or abuses them, right, in order to become a member of the group. And I think there's a lot of social pressure there. If you want to prove to yourself that you can endure the process, and you also want people around you to know that you can endure the process and get through it, and that you have what it takes to become whatever it is, that whatever the organization is that you are working to become a member of. And so it's, I don't blame people for having that desire. I had that desire. At the time that I, wanted to become an Omega, Jesse Jackson had run for president. Jesse Jackson was an Omega. Right. Is an Omega, I should say. And, I was greatly inspired by that. I wanted to be, a part of an organization that was bigger than me, that had comprised all of these great men. And there are incredible men in my organization. Mm-hmm. There are incredible, men who are a part of your organization, Phi Beta Sigma fraternity, incorporated. There are so many great individuals who we should be aspiring to be like. I often wonder, about the founders of my organization. Did they approve of these sort of hazing rituals, when they founded the organization? I don't know. I think that you can still have a process where people are challenged, to learn information, to show that they're committed to the organization and will be beyond just a year or 2 or 3 on a college campus, especially when it comes to the D9. But I also think that we can do it in a way where we're not causing harm to people. And you mentioned a really good point, Mark. You talked about how you can talk about the deaths, which are tragic, but there are a lot of people who have lingering effects from hazing, mental trauma, bad experiences, pain and shame that they don't speak out loud because you're not supposed to, or we convert those stories into war stories that we laugh about, and that we just kind of, we bond over, but we never really get to the heart of the trauma that impacted us directly. And I hope that my film will be able to spark some of those conversations.
It's interesting. You mentioned the war stories, and one of the really great voices in the film is Stacey Patton, right? And she talks about, what is it about these experiences of trauma, whether we're talking about these rituals and organizations or just of the traumatic experience of being Black, what that binds us together in this trauma, right? And the way that we process it is almost celebrating our survival of it. And the conversation that you have with Mark Lamont Hill, And Mark says very pointedly, right? And, you know, he's working through this process where I'm progressive in all these other ways about Black masculinity.
Yeah.
But when it comes to my D9 experience, right, I want to hold on to something. And both of you talk about, you know, there needs to be something to acknowledge that we go through a process that's important. And then Mark makes the point, right, that, you know, I'd like to think that however hard this process was, right, it helps me to be able to survive this other stuff, right? And he says that in the middle of the film. You go back to him later in the film, and it's a really different conversation where he's like, I think what bothers me is perhaps I'm not sure whether or not it was worth all of that.
Yeah.
Talk about that conversation with Mark for a moment, but also how you process that moment in the film.
Well, that was a very powerful conversation between Mark and I. And I wish that you had the opportunity to see that conversation play out in real time. You know,
I could imagine.
It was a much longer conversation than what actually made it into the film. And I think that I mean, you know Mark. Mark is, you know, he's super intelligent, you know, and he's a brilliant man. And I think what happened in that situation is that, you know, Mark was wrestling through some things as we were having the conversation, and, you know, found it hard to justify, you know, some of the more brutal aspects of that are part of, you know, many of these processes that we go through, right? And so I think, like most members of the D9, you know, who say that, you know, there were many positive aspects to the hazing that I went through, and I think that it was good for me. I think Mark was someone like that. I was someone like that. You know, I used to say that, you know, when I was younger. You know, I've been a member of my organization for over 30 years now. You know, so there was a time when I really bought that particular line that, you know, there are positive aspects to hazing, right?
Yeah.
And I think that Mark was working that out in real time. And, you know, I just think over the course of a conversation, you know, there was just a little bit of movement, you know, where he was able to acknowledge publicly that maybe, you know, his connection to, you know, this idea that you have to go through something very painful and very abusive,
right.
is not necessarily necessary in order for you to be a loyal, committed member of your organization.
Later in the film, Byron, you have a come to Jesus moment with one of your brothers, who highlights a moment where he felt as though you had crossed the line. And, you know, as he said, the stuff that he hadn't talked about for 27 years. Talk about that experience, right? In the midst of making this film that's raising all these questions and trying to answer them, you know, how did it feel for you as a filmmaker when some of those questions came directly back to you?
Oh, well, I wanted to, I welcomed the conversation with Yvel.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to have that conversation with Yvel because that was a moment that I remember. It was the very last time that I was physical with anyone who was trying to enter my organization. And you know, it's sort of, you know, I had made a pledge that I would not be that kind of big brother, you know, and then, you know, I had a moment where I failed, you know, I failed myself. I failed to live up to my own ethics and morals at that particular time. And I wanted to have that conversation with Yvel because I wanted to own and be accountable for my own behavior and how I caused harm to someone. Right. I mean, you know, this is not just me pointing a finger at everybody else. I mean, I participated in hazing culture. You know, I was somebody who, you know, internalized the physical abuse that I went through and endured during my process, and then, you know, perpetuated that to someone else. And so I wanted to have that moment with Yvel and give Yvel an opportunity to talk about how he experienced me as a big brother, right? You know, not you know, just me talking about my own perception of who I want to believe I was at that time, but who I really was. And so I thought that was a really, really powerful moment in the film, and I commend Yvel for his courage in talking openly about it. It's not easy for people to talk about their experiences with hazing and to do so publicly. again, because there's this culture of silence where we're not supposed to talk about it in public, in broad
Yeah.
view of other
Right.
people, especially acknowledging some of the pain that you experience, and also to make yourself so vulnerable. So that's why I have a tremendous amount of respect for Yvel Joseph, who is a participant in the film.
I think often in watching the film that the Kappa brother, right, whose legacy,
Yeah.
and of course his case is striking, because there's video evidence of what takes place. But you mentioned about that difficulty of speaking publicly about it, and when his parents realized something had happened, right, and he's literally finding every excuse in the book, right? I think one of these, he said, he explained to them he had some rough sex, right?
Yeah.
Rather than he would admit that to his parents,
Right.
rather than admit that he had gone through a debilitating hazing process. You begin the film with the two sisters, sorority sisters or pledges, who drown.
Kristen and Kenitha.
And you also end the film with them.
Yeah.
And there's a moment watching you with the young woman's mother on the beach. And I'm expecting, right? I'm expecting the Hollywood ending, right?
Mhm.
I'm expecting this moment of closure where someone who was involved, right? The online, those who were online with them, the senior members of the sorority at that moment, to own that moment. And the film ends with you, they don't, right? They refuse. None of the members, of the marching band, family marching member, Robert Champion, wanted to own that moment, right? And there were film in which at various times I was angry and sad. I was probably not any more angry than I was at that moment. That 20 something years later, in one case, right, that folks still aren't willing to own what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you sharing, how it felt for you as a viewer. It was frustrating for me as a filmmaker because, my producing team and, my producer, I want to give a shout out to Natalie Bullock Brown, who was one of the producers on the film.
Homegirl.
Yes. And Denise Green. And, we had other people who reached out to various people to get their comments or to, get them to just kind of share their side of the story. But I don't think anyone is as frustrated or hurt than, Pastor Pat, Pastor
Right.
Pat, Patricia Vargas, who is the mother, who all she wants is a little bit of closure. I mean, she's never going to give full closure about what happened, but, all she wants is, to know what really happened on that night.
Right.
And she's never received that, from anyone involved in the situation. And so that's hurtful to her, and, there's this hole that's in her heart that will be there forever. She said something that was really, really powerful to me when we were on the beach, and I wanted to include it, but it just didn't really work as a bite in the film. But she said, a hazing death is forever, a hazing death is forever. Of course, we know that death is death, death is final. But when she said it that way, it just struck me so hard, that she cannot get her daughter back. And it was because of something so senseless and trite, as seeking entrance into an organization. That was very powerful to me.
We've been talking with award-winning filmmaker Byron Hurt about his new film. The film is Hazing, which explores the practice that takes place in so many of these institutions of belonging, if you will. Byron, of course, is also the director of the award-winning film Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes, and also Soul Food Junkies. Byron, again, I got to say it, the work that you've been doing now for more than 2 decades, documenting, our experiences as Black people and doing it with love, with a particular lens on the Black male bodies that we inhabit. And this film is just a natural progression to, the astounding work that you've been doing throughout your career. So thank you, for this particular film and this message at this time.
Thank you, Mark. And, you know, I have great respect for you and all of the work that you've done as a writer and as a thinker and as a TV personality and radio personality. You know, I think we're kindred spirits in many ways. I just love the work that you're doing as well. So it's an honor to be in conversation with you and to be on your show in your 13th season.
Thank you very much, Byron.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.